Hi, this is James Stone, instructor for ART-200 at the Pennsylvania State University, and this is a demo of how to experiment a little bit, use a bottom-up design approach, and how to maybe approach your second project, which is a drawing tool. So the first thing I'm going to do here is maybe just set up a good size so that we can see what we're doing. So I'll do size. I think 800 is going to make a lot of sense here. So we've got our sketch. It's not really doing anything. But what I want to show you, and as you're watching this, is to watch kind of my approach to how I'm actually writing code here. So I'm going to create our setup, void setup, and place this here, our size. Okay, and I can just do a rect, and we'll just say like 20, 20, 40, 40, or something like this. Close with the parentheses, and we get a simple rectangle. Now, I'm just doing this to kind of prove, it's kind of like testing. I go, is it working? And I can see that it's working. So to create the simplest version of a drawing tool, we can just replace this, right? Mouse X and mouse Y, which is going to give us the coordinates of the mouse. And you can see now I'm able to kind of articulate with the mouse and see what's going on. All right, so this is kind of like the simplest way to start, and you already have some parameters here. Like, for example, I'm not clearing the screen at all, and so we just get one shape after another. And this is probably going to be one of the better approaches to start with. So to get to more standard kind of drawing style, we might do like 8 pixels by 8 pixels and do an ellipse, and we might start setting a few other things. Fill, and I'll just set the fill to black. And so now we should get a dark ellipse. Now, this is already starting to look a lot like a standard paint program. This is really not what I want you to do at all. So we're not creating like a Microsoft Paint. We're going to be a lot more experimental. So what I wanted to show you is here I am creating the basic semblance of the drawing program. Now, how can we change the parameters? So one thing you could do is change the way that we're interacting. We could say if mouse pressed, then draw the ellipse. And we're creating a conditional here. Okay, and we'll run this again, and you'll see I get nothing, but when I'm pressing the mouse and now I'm pressing the mouse, now I get some sort of articulation. And so this gives me a much more nuanced way of painting, which is a lot more familiar. So I will leave that for now, and let's add to it. So probably one of the first things that people experiment with or kind of want to play around with is like this idea of random. Now, we could do that, right? And this is like a very common approach, random 255, right? And we'll just do one color for now. So if you only use one parameter, it's only going to be from white to black, right? So we'll see what happens now. And so you'll see now I'm getting kind of random colors that are black or white. And if I start adding another color there, or for example, I could use a color like red 25500, which is a primary red. This isn't a very designed color, but just for the demonstration. And this value is the alpha value here. And run this, we're going to get kind of a different set of translucent reds, right? And I'll probably want to call no stroke. I don't know that I want that. So I'll also call up here no stroke. And this fill is no longer having an effect at all. And so here we go. And if I make this much larger, say 80 by 80, be able to see it a lot more closely, right? And so now we get, maybe this is too large. We might drop that down to say 30 by 30. And I'm just kind of guessing what these values should be. And so you can see now we've got kind of an interesting way of articulating our drawing, right? So this is just simple. We're just drawing one shape. We're following it with the mouse. So the position of the ellipse is with the mouse X and Y, and we have a static size, right? So we could also use random to articulate things other than color. And, you know, one of them, and you probably see this quite a bit, is to just do a completely random color altogether. This has a certain kind of look too. I don't know that it's necessarily the best look, but it can be quite nice. And so you'll see as we're drawing now, we get kind of random colors. You've maybe seen a similar effect to this as well. But let's just keep going with random. Like, what else could we do random with? Well, we could go and add a kind of a jittering effect to the mouse X and Y. We could say add random from, I don't know, 0. Well, it's normally 0. So we'll just say, I don't know. Let's start with a bigger number and see what happens. Random. So what this is going to do is take the mouse X value and then add random 100. And probably what we want to do, because the mouse is going to be at the center position, we want to articulate in all directions. We'd actually want to go from -100 to 100 to probably give us a little bit closer look to what I'm going for, which is just to kind of jitter and create some extra expression, kind of like a spray paint can, so to speak. And so now we've got kind of like the spray can, if you can imagine. And if we made this much smaller, for example, or started creating a variable, so we might say, so, you know, int size, or not int, but maybe float size equals 10, float jitter equals, I don't know, let's do a little bit less, like 50, and I can start to replace this. So we'll say negative jitter, jitter, negative jitter, jitter, and these 30s and 30s I'll replace with size. And I'm actually realizing size is a reserved word here, so we're gonna go and change it. So we'll call it the, I don't know, brush size, right? Want to avoid using reserved words. Here we go. Okay, and so what this allows us to do now is now we have this kind of set of parameters here with ellipse, and I'm just going to break the line so we can see a little bit better. We're replacing it with variables, and so now it's very easy for me to change these values, right? So we can say the brush size is, say, 2, which would be very small, and the jitter size would be, I don't know, let's say 5 pixels, right? So it'll give us a much tighter displacement, something really small. And there we go. So that's random, and this is just one idea. So if I was working on my sketch and I started experiment, I might go, okay, like this is like the first version. Let's go ahead and save this. I'll just save it on my desktop and I'll call it drawing tool I01 or something like that. So I'll call it I01 and then I'll go and save it again and I'll call it I02. So I have the first one and now I'm just going to kind of start to experiment more. So I might say, well, I didn't really like the random fill and maybe this is too much random, right? So let's just use one set of random to do something. And so I think probably the thing I liked the most was to go back to just a color, right? And so I'll just use a green color. We'll just, you know, try some different colors. It's very hard to see, so I might go in my setup, which is going to run once. We'll send background to 0, which will be black. And it appears a little bit better, but I want a little bit bigger size. So we'll set this to, say, 20. Random float doesn't work, so I think this needs to be an int. Random function int. Oh, here we go. I accidentally typed a 2. And so there we go. Just a little bit of jitter and that type of thing. So, I mean, this is kind of like a standard paint tool, but it's not really very expressive. we could experiment further. For example, maybe instead of using the fill, we'll say no fill, and we'll set the stroke. Right, so now we're getting kind of the outline of shapes, and this is kind of interesting. And so we've got jitter, we've got the brush size, and we've got static values here. So the question becomes, right, well, what could we do? We could have massive jitter, we could do all types of things. The other thing we could do, so this is running in a game loop, right? And loops might be new. This is maybe a little bit more advanced technique as we're getting started, but we could put everything in a simple for loop, which would mean that it repeats. So this is running through like 60 frames per second. So every time 60 frames, 60 times per second, it runs through this and sets the brush size and the jitter, sets no fill, and then it checks to see if the mouse is pressed, right? So one thing we could say is if the mouse is pressed, we could say for int I equals 0, I plus plus, I is less than, and I'll just pick a value, so it's obvious, like 100. And then we'll open this up. We'll go to the end and then indent both of these. Keep everything nice and clean. And so now when we run it, say made a mistake here for int I, error on greater than. There we go. I had a little mistake there in my for loop. And you'll see now that, and these are just shapes. It's maybe a little bit too intense, right? So maybe I'll increase the jitter to see how that is looking, right? I'll increase that to 50. And you'll see we're getting a really different kind of brush, right? And you see how we're getting more and more experimental as we go. All right. So maybe I'll save this as drawing tool number 3. All right, cool. So we've got drawing tool number 3. And so I might think about, well, where do I want to go now? Where do I want to experiment? I don't really like the green, so maybe I might choose a different color. And let's think about ways to drive the color. One way to drive the color might be the mouse position, right? What's the value of mouse X and Y? So we could very easily go in here and add a fill instead of having no fill. Maybe we're going to use a filled color. And let's say we're using green, so it might be interesting. We'll have red, and then we'll adjust the opacity so they kind of mix. And we'll set this value to mouse Y. Let's see what happens. Right. So the problem here is the mouse Y value is probably way too large. I'm just putting this so we can see what the value is down here. So you see the value is, 590, but it should be lower. And here it's at like 11. So see the articulation is only right here. There's an easy way to fix this. There's a function called map. All right, so the way the map works is you give it a value. Well, if we scroll down here, it's maybe more obvious. We give it a value, the start value, the end value, the start value for 2, and the stop value for 2. And the start value is the lower bounds of the current range, right? And so we can go here and experiment and go, well, what is the kind of the range here? And I'll remove the map temporarily. So if we run this and look at the value, it looks like the value can go actually a little bit negative if I hold down the mouse and go up, and goes all the way up to about 800, which is the size of the sketch. So one thing we want to do is we'll do map. We'll take the mouse Y value and we'll start the starting value, which is probably 0. It could go negative, right, as we're seeing, but we'll start with 0. And right here, since we're using the Y, we'll use the height of the sketch. So this is like the input values. And so now we want to think about, well, what are those values that we want it to go out to? Well, for color, it goes from 0 to 255. So we'll start at 0, and the high value would be 255, right? I forgot my parentheses here. We'll go ahead and run it again. And don't see too much change because I'm using it in the print line. So the values seem to be about right, but I forgot to put it where we're changing the color. So instead of mouse Y here, we're going to use what I just created. We'll run that again. And so see, now we're getting a little bit better articulation, but you might look at these values and go, well, this is not exactly, I mean, it's really nice up here, but down here, this is not working as well. So we might change those values, right? So this is going to be 0 and this is 255. So maybe we can just guess and say this is like, I don't know, like 75, 80. I don't know. I'm just making a guess here. So I'll add here 80, run it again. And so see, now I'm kind of dialing in to a better set of parameters. It looks a little bit better like what I'm going for. Great. So I might save this version as version 4 and say, this is kind of cool. I'm liking where this is going. But maybe now the green isn't working as well, or maybe I want to articulate that a little bit differently. And so we could think about, well, what else could we do there? So another thing that we could do is we could use mouse X. So there's a mouse X. So if we do println mouse X, and I'm going to remove this one here, we run it. This is across the X axis, and put the LN so we can see a little bit better. So here we have values again from 0. And the other thing that we have is another one called P mouse X. So println P mouse X. Okay. And there we go. And so what I'll do is I'll just do println. We'll say X equals, so we can illustrate what this is. And then we'll say PX equals and plus, and we'll run this. And so we should get some interesting values here. You'll see everything's 765, but as soon as I start to articulate, you'll see the values are very similar, but they're just changing. And so what P mouse X is actually the previous mouse location. So if I go in, we'll just quickly comment all of this out and go to a more simple drawing style like we had before, ellipse, and we'll say use the same one here. We'll get rid of the jitter, right? We have mouse X to mouse Y. And what I want to do is do something different. So we have an ellipse. In this case, we'll draw a line. So we'll say line, and we'll say mouse X, mouse Y to P mouse X to P mouse Y. And I'm just going to set the stroke to be white so that we can see it. And you'll see what we get now. And if you remember before, when I would draw, we would get gaps in between things. Now we get kind of a continuous line. And if I really articulate this, you'll see how it starts to break up and be longer. So this is what, like, the simplest way of using the P mouse and like the mouse X and P mouse X and Y together. But we can do some other interesting things with it, right? So for example, we can go and create a new variable, and we will just call this int velocity, and we'll say it equals. In fact, I don't want to use an int, I'll use a float, and we'll say this equals mouse, mouse x minus mouse p mouse, or sorry, p mouse x mouse x minus p mouse x, right? And we'll just println that value to see what it is. Get rid of these two here. And so I'm still drawing the line, but see the values here? As I'm going slower, it's 0. And then as I go up and down, there's not really that much articulation, but going this way, you'll see we start to get more articulation, right? So this we probably should call velocity x. I'll call it vel x to make it a little bit easier to remember. And we could calculate the same thing for y, right? And so now we've got velocity across two parameters, right? VLX, let's say y, and change this to y and this to y. So what could we do with these, right? Now we've got two more values, velocity x, velocity y. And a more advanced way of doing this, if you just wanted general the velocity, is to do dist function. You can look into that yourself. So I'm going to go uncomment this, and we'll remove the line, and we'll remove the stroke, and we'll take a look what's going on. So here we are, we have the same kind of thing. So one thing we could do is we could make this jitter, this random jitter, we could change the value of it, but it might be more interesting to change the value based on the direction, right? So we've got this jitter and that jitter. And we got the velocity here. But let's just start maybe with something simple. So we'll just adjust the jitter value. So we have this jitter variable that we already created, right? And this could be a float, might work a little bit better. Let's go and take the jitter, and we'll say float, we'll say jitter equals jitter times, we'll say that it equals, yeah. I think we want to do a map here. So we'll map the value, and the values we're going to get from velocity, I think we got about 30 or 50 is the highest. So we'll say negative, I don't know, 50 to 50, and we'll remap those to the values of 50 we had here. And so we'll go from 0 jitter to 50, which is the original jitter value, right? In fact, we could probably even just use that same variable here. If we wanted map float, and then we have to go to value. And so the value should be vel x. We'll use that one. And so you'll see it goes, we go up and down, we get the same kind of articulation, but as we go side to side, we get a lot more variation. Now, I think the variation isn't quite right, and I'll run this again. So you might have to experiment with the values, right? So we're mapping, and so it's always kind of 50, right? And it's always 50 because we're saying from 0 to jitter, and it's probably not at 0 exactly. At 0, it's going to be that. So maybe we'll say, you know, from here, we'll see if this gets us closer to what we want. This is kind of more what I was expecting. Something that jitters more the faster we go. Now, I think it doesn't quite give the right action here, but as you start to expand, it does. And I would even like more jitter, so I might expand this value out, right? So now we get this really nice kind of explosive thing. Okay. So we have this value, and then we'll want this 0 to jitter to 50. Maybe we would remap this slightly different. Maybe we're going to say from, I don't know, -5 or -10. Let's try -5. Let's see if that gives us a little bit of better action, like what we're looking for. And I think it does. It starts to start a little bit faster, maybe too fast. Maybe I'll just kind of dial this back down a little bit more. And so now we get pretty good action, very slow. And then as we go faster, we're going to get a better articulation of it. But you'll notice it's only going kind of one way, right? And so one way to kind of fix that is to get rid of the negative values. We could just do ABS, which is for absolute. And now it should articulate the same going either direction. So that's kind of more what I was expecting. So I might go, hey, this is cool. I like this idea. We'll save this as number 5, right? And these ideas that I'm articulating, you know, I'm a little bit more advanced. So maybe you want to start smaller, right? Making smaller changes and not doing so many changes as I am for the 40 or 50 sketches that you're creating. So we also have velocity Y. So we could do all sorts of cool stuff with this, but I think probably the most interesting one might be to adjust the amount of this value 100. So one thing we could do is say, well, I think it's actually a little bit harder because I'll have to change the value here, but that's easy to do. Let's do that. Okay. We'll call int to make sure that it's an int value instead of a float. We'll say map. We're going to give it the value, which is the velocity y. And we're going to give the starting value, which, you know, we already kind of figured out what those values are. -2 and 50 seem to be good values. And then we'll say, how many do we want to draw? We for sure want to draw 1, right? And so we should certainly start there. And they say, like, maybe, what were we drawing up to 100 before? So it seemed like a good value. Let's keep it the same. And so we'll see what that action's like. So we should still have this same kind of thing here, right? Where it can go much bigger. But when we change on the Y, you'll see it goes all the way to here. We get like nothing. So it's the velocity of the Y. So the faster we go, and then it disappears. So it's not behaving exactly the way I'm expecting. And I think the reason why is we're using the absolute values part of it. So the faster we go, it's kind of drawing less of the circles, or it might be the opposite. Let's try and switch these around. All right. And we'll change that maybe to 5. So now we get a lot of drawing here. And as we go faster, it gets kind of light. So that's certainly not what I want. So let's do from 50 to 100. So maybe that's interesting. I mean, what's interesting is you could go very fast and kind of really scatter the whole screen. And I might go, you know, I'm not really feeling it. I don't really like the way this is working. So maybe I'll start over. So maybe I'll save that as IO6. Right? And so this is the thing with iteration. You might go, you know, like, I don't really like the direction this is going. I'm going to go back and let's go back to drawing tool number 3. Right? And so from here we are in drawing tool number 3. Go and run this again. And here's where we were with drawing tool number 3. And so this is kind of the idea with a bottom-up design, right? To do really fast experimentation, to kind of experiment with some different parameters, and all sorts of things like that. So this is just a quick introduction to get you started. Hope this is useful. Okay.